Welcome to my session. My name is Alex Saric. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Ivalua. Quick administrative note, my colleague Jared McAdoo has just commented also in the chat. But if you do have any questions at any point, please do enter them in the chat window or the Q&A window, and he will make sure to answer as many as we possibly can. I suspect the presentation will go fairly close to the end, so please do make sure to enter your questions. Now, the subject today that I'd like to speak about is environmental, social, and governance initiatives, otherwise referred to as ESG or CSR. This is a topic that, as I'm sure everyone is aware, has really risen in prominence on the corporate agenda in recent years, and certainly this year it's been very high for a variety of reasons. Increasingly, consumers and employees want to associate themselves with brands whose values they align with. We have governments passing increasing legislation, regulations, mandating certain activities, and a lot of business leaders fundamentally would like to contribute and improve society. So for all these reasons, it's become very important. Now, unfortunately, a lot of issues have also risen in prominence, and we see them, and it feels like a weekly basis on the news as well, indicating the importance of actually taking action. If we look at an environmental perspective, there are so many examples that I could have used. I picked one here for a couple of reasons, which shows rivers in Germany. If we look at last year, which is really what the picture on the left represents, this is an image of the Rhine, where water levels fell to such historically low levels that it really disrupted people's holidays as cruise ships could not get through, supply chains, relocations as container ships could not make it through, and really ship traffic ground to a halt for quite some time. Now, fast forward to just this recent summer, and the exact opposite scenario is in play, where rivers were so flooded with such an unprecedented amount of water that in some cases entire towns were wiped away. I like this example because one, it illustrates just the extreme nature of the environmental factors that are impacting us now, and how whether we're at home or whether we're at work, we're equally likely to be impacted.
Hey, Alex, how are you doing? Sorry, I want to quickly interrupt here. We do not see a presentation yet. I just wanted to make sure that everybody could see it, because you don't want to ruin it to your presentation. Sorry about the interruption, guys. Perfect.
Okay, hopefully you can see now.
You can see perfectly fine. Enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So apologies for that. So hopefully here you can see the images which reflect what I just discussed, the rivers in Germany. And unfortunately, this is an increasingly common occurrence across geographies, wherever you may be. So it is impacting us both as individuals as well as businesses. Now, if we turn towards social and ethical issues, similarly, these are regularly in the news, certainly on social media as well. One of the real plagues impacting the world today is forced and child labor. The image on the right really represents some of the protests that are striking the fashion industry, where the cotton supply chain has been flagged as having a significant amount of forced labor involved in it. If we look on the left, it's a different example. In this case, a boycott by 21 organizations being called of Pillsbury, which is owned by GM, and you can see the cartoon that they've put together on it. And this is really in response to Pillsbury being listed by the UN among organizations that are violating Palestinian rights because of some of the supply chain involved in East Jerusalem. So it really doesn't matter if it's social, environmental, it's very difficult to not be impacted these days. Now, one thing I do want to call out is businesses fundamentally, and I certainly believe this, are not proactively trying to violate human rights, to damage the environment, but really it's not enough. We have to be very careful, because simply by not asking the right questions, we can inadvertently be encouraging this, let alone not helping to address the problem. And this is a quote that's been used in a variety of contexts, and I think it's very relevant when we look at ESG initiatives. You know, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I think it's very relevant. It's not enough to simply not proactively, use children in your supply chains or proactively poison the environment simply by not asking, by not specifying what our requirements are, by really asking the right questions of the suppliers. We can really encourage this. A great example is if you're sourcing a category, if you're not asking and telling suppliers that they have to meet certain minimum requirements, and you ultimately just select a supplier or a set of suppliers based on cost, you can inadvertently be encouraging and shifting volume towards a a portion of the supply chain that actually leverages child labor, because that allows them to produce at lower cost. So it's very important to actually take action. And organizations certainly have. There have been a lot of statements, and in many cases also that's been backed by action to try to remedy some of these problems. But are we doing enough? And I would argue not. And this is a handful of statistics from a few different sources, just to show a variety here. They really kind of support that there's so much more that we should be doing. 60 million people are still estimated as being exploited through forced labor in the private sector. It's a huge number. We have almost 2/3 of organizations that have yet to invest in supply chain sustainability, or at the very early stages. Slightly over a third of CPOs are only measured on ESG goals. And over half of European suppliers in a recent study said that corporate buyers rarely or never include ethical labor practices in contracts. So really following through and making sure this isn't happening still has a long way to go. Now, one of the challenges with this that often keeps organizations from moving further or faster is this perception of, is there a trade-off? Do I have to compromise business results, which ultimately is what I'm primarily measured on, if I want to improve our ESG performance? And it begs the question, is that trade-off still valid? Does it really exist? Now, I have to admit that if you're looking at an individual case, there are often cases where there absolutely is a trade-off. If you're trying to award a particular contract to a set of suppliers, it's unlikely that the lowest cost possible mix also happens to be the one with the best ESG criteria. So there may be some cases where you have to trade off cost in particular against ESG. But if we step away from the individual decisions and look at an aggregate level, the data increasingly suggests that that trade-off really isn't there anymore. We commissioned Forrester Consulting to conduct a study on ESG to take a look at the current state, some of the challenges, as well as what's actually working in organizations. And this is one of the results where we asked specifically what benefits companies that had launched ESG initiatives have actually realized in the last 12 months. This is the top 5, which were very tightly clustered. And they really represent that there's a broad set of benefits that a large majority of organizations are actually realizing. Now, admittedly, some of these are soft, maybe qualitative metrics, improved supplier relationships, brand image, may be a bit harder to measure, but others, such as increased sales, are very material. And the study focused specifically on sustainability that we had collaborated with Procurement on earlier this year, found procurement leaders with more advanced sustainability programs were more than twice as likely to have both an increase in sale and improved product and service quality. And we see this in many studies from other parties as well, that increasingly ESG is really paying off in terms of the perception of the brand, driving sales volume. So it may not always necessarily result in lower or equal cost, but the benefits tend to outweigh any trade-offs. So this is really an important factor to consider, that this is really not an argument anymore in most cases for inaction. Now, businesses seem to increasingly acknowledge this. And in the same study, Forrester asked how important organizations view a range of CSR priorities. And every single one that was asked, which is listed here, a majority of organizations said that they were very important to the company. But a couple of things to note. One, it's interesting to see that environmental factors are still at the top. The top 3 are really here all around the environment, the carbon footprint, but the social and ethical ones have really closed the gap from where they had been in a few years. They're not very far behind. But the concerning thing here, and perhaps the unsurprising one, is while the majority of saying that everything is very important to them, less than half in most cases, generally at somewhere between 22 and 33%, are actually backing that up with official policies, official targets. So there's definitely a disconnect between words and action at this point. And some of it is definitely, I'm sure, related to lip service, because who is not in the current climate going to say that they view these factors as very important? But I do fundamentally believe that most leaders would like to have a positive impact, but there are other factors holding them back, even when their heart really is behind it. Now, when we looked at the challenges with Forrester, really 2 things stood up as the primary obstacles to keeping organizations from making more progress. And these really revolve around transparency and collaboration. Now, the first 2 specific ones, both really tied to transparency, they're closely linked, which is a large number of organizations really struggle to effectively make the right decisions to assess their suppliers. The number one is assessing the performance of an individual supplier. really pulling in the information from the supplier, from third parties internally, and having an accurate view on really how does the supplier measure up from an ESG, CSR perspective. And that naturally translates to the very second one, is then how do I do that at an aggregate level, looking across all my suppliers and looking into the supply chain, into my suppliers. This is still a big problem. It's the old bugaboo of data, and organizations really need to put in the processes, the systems to get this under control. And then the third one here is really around collaboration. CSR, by its definition, requires close collaboration with internal stakeholders to align to the priorities, the objectives, the relative importance of different ones, and naturally with suppliers as well, to actually communicate those, collaborate on how to achieve them. Organizations can get by manually by working with a handful of key suppliers offline, but to really drive the type of change that we need, this needs to be done at a much more industrial scale, if you will, addressing more suppliers, more categories, getting deeper in the supply chain. And this is where phone calls and emails just aren't going to scale. And companies lack the systems to drive that type of effective, scalable collaboration. So let's turn now and take a look at what's actually working. So this is what's holding back organizations that haven't made much progress. But we also want to look at the organizations that are making significant progress. What are the top strategies that they're actually employing that we can learn from as well? And Forrester looked at two areas specifically. One is on sustainability, so focusing on the environmental factor. And the second is more broadly, how do you balance this broad set of CSR objectives with cost to not have a significant impact on cost? And the top strategies were remarkably similar, just a slight difference in ranking fundamentally. And this is also quite consistent with what we've seen working with many of the world's leading organizations, IKEA, L'Oreal, that have really invested in making significant progress here. So just going down the list here, giving suppliers more flexibility in how they meet requirements has really been the top successful strategy for sustainability. It allows suppliers to provide their knowledge, their know-how, to allow them to innovate, to find more creative solutions. The second strategy here was digitizing supplier collaboration. It was actually the top strategy from balancing cost versus risk, and the second for sustainability. And that really gets down to the more advanced organizations have addressed this challenge that's holding other companies back. The third here is setting minimal sustainability criteria for suppliers during selection. It's very closely tied to pre-screening suppliers, the second strategy on the right, on CSR, and then competitively bidding. So being very clear on what the requirements are up front, and then being competitive and trying to get the lowest price among the ones that meet the requirements is a common strategy that's helped yield results for many organizations. And the fourth one is slightly different between the two. One is improving the supplier reporting capabilities. Again, this is addressing that obstacle that's holding less mature organizations back. And the right-hand side, having a more balanced selection. So these are some things to consider. Now, what I'd like to do and leave you with today is my personal checklist, really the 5 things that I found both from our studies with Forrester, Procurious, others, as well as our closer work with many of the world's leading organizations from an ESG perspective. What really you should consider if you want to drive real step change improvement, not just one time, but ongoing improvements. And I would say at a high level, there are 2 areas that are absolutely critical. The first is you have to empower procurement to be able to drive those results. Procurement is the tip of the spear for an organization to drive a lot of these improvements. And it's really critical to empower those teams so they can go ahead and make significant progress. And then we have to look outward to the suppliers and effectively engage and empower them as well to ultimately help and support you in meeting those objectives. If we look internally at procurement, there are 2 things that we really call out and that I find are absolutely essential. The first one is you need to have the top-down organizational support so procurement can prioritize ESG. And by that, I don't mean having a nice value proposition, nice statements. Those, of course, are part of the picture, but they're really a starting point. The organizations that we've seen really have success and drive effective ESG programs flow those down so that it is material. It flows down into the MBOs, the KPIs that procurement is measured against, so that they're rewarded for achieving ESG gains. Otherwise, what happens is you effectively say nice things, say that something is important, but then you ultimately rely on procurement to effectively work against their best interest to do the right thing. And that is never a recipe for success. This is really something that we've consistently seen differentiate the organizations that have made progress versus those that have not made much. This is really an early obstacle. It's a relatively easy one within all our control, but too many organizations haven't made that transition from the high-level lofty statements to the actual KPIs, and that's key. The second is addressing this issue around data and ensure that procurement has the data and the tools so they can make the right decisions. They can effectively assess their suppliers. They can monitor the progress. And there are two things that are important to keep in mind here. One is you need to make sure that the systems you have access to the right third-party information. So you can validate important details that perhaps suppliers have self-reported. You can use that to effectively qualify, identify new suppliers. And then the second is you need to make sure the systems give you access to the insights you need to have true 360-degree visibility of that supplier. We're talking about ESG here, it's important, but of course, we're not making decisions in any case purely based on ESG. We also need to consider risk, we need to consider supplier performance, cost, and other factors as well. So it's really essential to make optimal decisions and to minimize the trade-offs to have that 360-degree view. The screenshot that I have here is from our platform. It's showing an ESG scorecard for a particular fictitious supplier, leveraging information from EcoVadis, who we have a tight partnership with, and seamlessly pull that data. And a couple of things to note here. One, it breaks down ESG into a range of areas from environment, ethics, etc. And what's not visible here is the user can actually go in and click and see the details behind it to understand why a particular supplier is rated highly or poorly in a certain area. It's important to have that detail so you can do the follow-ups, investigate, especially if you're looking to improve results and push suppliers to do that at their end. The second is, at the top, there are a range of tabs, and this information is here focused on ESG, but you can very quickly mingle it together or just flip and get more details on the financials, on their risk, on their performance, etc., to have that 360-degree view. And this is really essential to just making smart decisions and minimizing any potential trade-off on a case-by-case basis. Now, once you have procurement that has the right tools, the right incentives to act, nothing is really going to drive significant progress if the suppliers aren't part of this process. So it's key to engage and empower them. And I've really found that there are three things that need to be kept in mind to do this effectively. And there's certainly correlation with a lot of these strategies that came out from the Forrester. The first one is it's very important to be very clear in defining what the minimum requirements that you expect of your supply chain are, and also what are the goals going forward. So organizations are often too vague in a lot of these. When leaders, and IKEA is a great example, are very prescriptive. If you want to do business with us, you need to meet these requirements. And it comes down in their case to the minimum wages they have to pay in certain countries, to their employees, to the conditions under which animals involved in the supply chain are kept, and a range of other factors. But being very prescriptive, both ensures there is no misalignment, miscommunication, understandings between it, and it can also very quickly let suppliers know if they're willing to do so, or if it's just not a relationship that's going to happen. And then defining the goals is also very important, because few organizations are where they really need to be, want to be from an ESG perspective. So we may want to set minimum goals, but ultimately we want to drive improvements. And a lot of the leading organizations work with suppliers that have that joint commitment to driving that improvement, and they want to collaborate on how far they can get and what time period. So this is a really important ingredient if you're going to really empower your suppliers and engage them. Now, the second point is it gets down to one of these top strategies that came out from the Forrester study, is provide flexibility wherever possible in how suppliers meet your requirements. Now, it's not always possible. Sometimes you do need a very specific parts, very specific specifications. But more often than not, there are opportunities to provide more flexibility. And this allows suppliers to unlock innovation, creative ideas, and it's a great way to eliminate trade-offs. An example that I'm familiar with from a company I've worked with in the past is a business that was building a new office building and was in the process of sourcing the HVAC, the heating, ventilation, the air conditioning systems for that. Now, typically, a lot of organizations would go ahead and identify we need so many units, they need to have this much power, BTUs, and then compare based on service, based on price, and ultimately select one or more suppliers. But this business actually chose to take a different approach and be very open-ended. They provide detailed specifications on the building, the structure, the environment in which it's in, the climatic conditions that they require at different hours of the day and of the week, and left it to suppliers to come back with what their recommended solution was, which of course included many traditional HVAC units, but actually the winning bid that came up with the lowest long-term cost, and at the same time actually had the lowest carbon footprint. It was a very creative, environmentally friendly approach. And it was a great example of really, in their case, not just eliminating the trade-off, but flipping it around, so that by being more flexible, they were actually able to achieve improved environmental standards at lower cost than the less environmentally friendly option would have enabled them to do. The last point here is something that we mentioned with the successful strategies. You really need to digitize collaboration to drive that scale, that efficiency. And specifically, there are three things that are important to keep in mind. It's important that systems that you leverage allow you to securely share information, especially if you're starting to get into detailed product specifications, new products. This is really an important requirement that you can do that directly in the platform when you're working with suppliers. Second is systems that enable you to upload or enable your suppliers to have access and upload information on their suppliers are really essential. Probably the least advanced area currently in ESG is visibility into the sub-tier. And it's so critical. We're so exposed to issues that occur, and even advanced organizations still have relatively poor visibility into their sub-tier. Trying to have suppliers provide that information offline in spreadsheets and trying to map it together is simply not viable. So systems that allow suppliers to enter their information both allow you to very easily map exactly what the sub-tier looks like without extra steps. And they also allow you to better verify that information. And if you so choose, you can always pull in third-party information on those sub-tier suppliers to validate information yourself as well. So it is an important part, and I think this is an area that's going to drive a lot of the gains in the future because there's still so much room to improve in terms of visibility in the sub-tier. And then lastly, the last 2 points are somewhat related here. Your system should allow you to define action or improvement plans. As I mentioned with the goals, very few companies are where they need to be. The suppliers are no better or worse than we are. We can drive some quick gains by setting requirements and more effectively more evenly weighing ESG against cost and other factors when selecting suppliers. But to really drive the type of ongoing improvement that we need, it's going to be critical to work together and to set these goalposts and work towards that. So systems that allow you to define improvement plans, action plans when there's a problem, and automatically notify you of progress or lack of progress really make it so much more simple to do this. The screenshot here on the left, which I know is very small because it's about 1/6 or 1/8 the size it normally would be, is an example of this type of an action plan. In this case, this is a company that had an informal diversity initiative and decided that they want to put more structure around and really verify if the information that suppliers have been providing is accurate. So they defined an action plan for all the suppliers that have indicated various types of diversity status to provide their certifications because they're third parties and proof that can support that with specific deadlines. And then they set this up and then they're automatically notified when suppliers upload the necessary information. They can do a check, or if they fail to do so, and it allows them to follow up. And these type of processes make it so much more efficient and scalable than maintaining some kind of separate Excel or offline sheet with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of suppliers that are supposed to act, and that simply is not scalable. So just to summarize, to wrap up, there is huge potential for organizations to drive impacts on society today. Many business leaders genuinely want to do so, and certainly we're increasingly being pressured by our employees, our customers, by governments to do so. So if you want to really drive the impact, my recommendation, the checklist, again, that we've seen from research, from our own experiences with some very successful organizations, really come down to empowering procurement with the right support and the right incentives and the tools and data so they can optimize decisions, and then following that through with the right engagement and empowerment of your suppliers. Being very clear on what you expect from them, giving as much flexibility as you can in how they meet those requirements, and ensuring that you're enabling effective, scalable collaboration. And if you do that, you'll be well on the path to driving significant gains, which we can all certainly benefit from. So I wish everyone the best of luck and hope to see significant improvements in organizational ESG in the future. One thing I will say, I referred to a couple studies during my presentation, the Forrester one, which we have just concluded, and an earlier one this year focused specifically on sustainability that we collaborated with Procurious on. Both of these studies are available. You can either see the URL over here, or you can simply go to Ivalua.com and the resources page, and you can download these as well as other reports. So I'd encourage you to do so if you want to see more details and commentary behind that. And otherwise, I would like to thank you for your time, and apologies for not sharing at the beginning some of the very brief technical glitch on my end, and hope you have a wonderful event. Thank you.